And Lee, you are muted.
Sorry about that.
I was just guessing whether you were. I thought Welsh is live. Was live. I'll say the page are moving now and again. Don't know whether to.
A page where I should be pronouncing all these landowners
Yes.
properly, which I won't, and I'll skip just because I will embarrass myself. Anyway, a lot of rich folks, these landowning parasites, also rake in massive subsidies. In fact, Greenpeace confirmed that 16 members of the British aristocracy are included in the top 100 list of those presently receiving EU subsidies, with 7.1 million pounds being shared out between them alone last year. This article was written before the finalization of the Brexit deal. This privileged landowning class evolved from a fusion of the old aristocracy and the newly enriched bourgeoisie. Landed property in Britain has its roots in the Norman conquest, but was later enhanced by the enclosures and destruction of the commons, and with it the destruction of the peasantry. In other words, today's monopoly in land ownership was originally a product of conquest, violence, and plunder, through which the common people were robbed of their ties with the soil. The small occupiers of land were reduced to day laborers and hirelings, which was an essential requirement for the development of capitalism. According to a popular 17th century rhyme, the law locks up the man or woman who steals a goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Landed property played a very important part in the emergence of capitalism. Although feudal in origin, it was transformed by the actions of capital, where rent in kind was transformed into money rent, the genesis of capitalist ground rent. The transformation of rent in kind into money rent, writes Marx, that takes place at first sporadically and then on a more or less national scale presupposes an already more significant development of trade, urban industry, commodity production in general, and therefore monetary circulation. It's from Volume 3 of Capital. Landed property played a very important part in the emergence of capitalism. Although feudal in origin, it was transformed by the actions of capital, where rent in kind was transformed into money rent, the genesis of capitalist ground rent. This is part of the overall process Marx describes as quote unquote primitive accumulation, which destroyed the old relations, creating a propertyless proletariat on the one hand and a concentration of large landed estates on the other. These estates were leased out to tenant farmers and provided the basis for capitalist agriculture and the agrarian revolution of the 18th century, which in turn provided the food for the growing urban population. With the development of industry and the growth of urban society, capitalist agriculture had to produce a greater output with a diminishing workforce of agricultural laborers. It succeeded in doing this through the introduction of new techniques to increase the productivity of labor, producing more with fewer and fewer hands. Without this growing agricultural surplus, there could be no division of labor, growth of industry, or social wealth. Without it, there could have been no industrial revolution. As Marx explained, quote, nowhere in the world has capitalist production since Henry VII dealt so ruthlessly with the traditional relations of agriculture, adapting and subordinating the conditions to its own requirements, unquote. That's from Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 2. But this came with a price. As Marx noted, quote, if money comes into the world with a congenial blood stain on one cheek, capital comes dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt, unquote. Next section, land equals money. Today, land ownership is kept as a closely guarded secret. The UK land registries were created and designed to conceal ownership, not reveal it. Quote, what we do know, however, is that the aristocracy and the royal family still play an important role in the ownership of our country. More than a third of land is still in the hands of aristocrats and traditional landed gentry, unquote, explained a recent Country Life magazine. It reveals that some 36,000 people, 0.6% of the population, own more than half of rural land in England and Wales. In Scotland, land ownership is even more extreme. And yes, we know about, that there was all this Seizing of land. In fact, Scotland has the most unequal land ownership in Western Europe, with just 432 powerful landlords owning 50% of the land, reserved mainly for such worldly pursuits as grouse shooting and stag hunting. Landlordism is big business, as the figures above show. The landlord class is a part of the ruling class who live off the fat of the land at the expense of the labor of others. Capitalist landed property is the source of massive wealth, at least through its monopoly, inflated values, and means of speculation. For example, the Emperor Group exchanged contracts to acquire a property in Wardour Street for £260 million, reflecting a capital value of £2,896 per square foot. Such examples of astronomical property prices could be repeated many times over. Historically, prior to the rise of capitalism, revenue from landed property was regarded as respectable income, while interest-bearing capital was associated with usury and very much frowned upon, especially by the church. However, with the emergence of the capitalist mode of production and the struggle between the aristocracy and the rising bourgeoisie, rent was regarded as unearned income accruing to a parasitic and idle class of landlords. The battle cry of the rising bourgeoisie against the old aristocracy was taken up by David Ricardo and Adam Smith, the leaders of the classical economists, in their theory of rent. They demanded the abolition of the Corn Laws, introduced in 1815, which would undermine the landlords, enhance free trade, and benefit the industrialists. Repeal of the Corn Laws would mean cheaper food, enabling them to reduce wages and so compete more effectively on the world market. The interest of the landlord is always opposed to that of the consumer and manufacturer, stated their champion Ricardo. The bourgeois economists preach the principles of laissez-faire, where everyone should be free to follow their own self-interest. And we talked about that, yesterday in terms of principal agent, right? The idea of, self-interest is what actually causes some of the problems. Nevertheless, the landlords fought a rearguard value to protect their sources of income. At this time, they dominated the House of Commons as well as the Lords. In this bitter struggle between these two sections of the ruling class, the landlord-dominated Parliament, out of revenge, hit back by linking up with the demands of the working classes for shorter hours and better conditions to pass the factory hours that placed restrictions on the hours of work. This hit the industrialists where it hurt most, in their pockets. They waged a systematic guerrilla war against these acts, which they were eventually forced to grudgingly accept. In the end, however, the more wealthy industrial bourgeoisie, they won out. The Corn Laws were repealed by a Tory government under Peel, yes, Peel of the Peelers, with Whig, that is, Liberal support. This split the Tory party, which was recreated under Benjamin Disraeli, of the slippery pole, and transformed from a party of landowners into a party primarily of finance capital. With the merging of landed, commercial, and industrial interests through intermarriage and business, capitalist relations began to dominate agriculture. As a result, rent was as often collected by the rich capitalist or financier as it was by a member of the aristocracy or its agents. Now, rent as an unearned income became respectable. Both landlord and capitalist, whose interests now merged, faced a common enemy in the increasing opposition from the working class, who were squeezed at both ends from low wages and high rents. What is rent? Marx, in his analysis of the capitalist mode of production, was forced to take up the errors of the classical economists, including their confused exposition of rent and their failure to recognize the form of absolute rent. Marx spent a great deal of time analyzing the subject, mainly because it was so central to the bourgeois economists of the time. Thus, he spent 200 pages on the subject in the third volume of Capital, and a sizable section of Volume 2 of the Theories of Surplus Value. Now, in these works, he provides hundreds of examples to illustrate his numerous points and to challenge his opponents. Now, his contribution reveals a meticulous approach to the subject, at least in the 19th century context. Marx regarded rent as secondary to the main issue, mainly of how the surplus value produced by the working class was creamed off and shared out amongst different wings of the ruling class. Marx, nevertheless, regarded it as secondary to the main issue, mainly of how the surplus value produced by the working class was creamed off and shared out amongst different wings of the ruling class, rather than the key issue of how surplus value originates in the first place. The circumstances under which the capitalist has to turn to share a part of the surplus labor or surplus value which he's captured with a third non-working person are only of secondary importance, explained Marx. It is also a fact of production that after the part of the value which is equal to constant capital is deducted, the entire surplus value passes straight from the hands of the worker to those of the capital, with the exception of that part of the value of the product which is paid out as wages. So there's something else there, right? The capitalist confronts the worker as the direct owner of the entire surplus value in whatever manner he may later be sharing it with the money-lending capitalist, landowner, etc. Unquote. Marx also makes the point elsewhere in Capital. The analysis of landed property in its various historical forms lies outside the scope of the present work. We're concerned with it only insofar as a portion of the surplus value that capital produces falls to the share of the landowner. And he also adds, quote, without this, our analysis of capital would not be complete, unquote. So it was to complete his analysis of capitalist production that Marx embarked on his theory of rent. To begin with, Marx had to explain the concept of ground rent and where it came from. Now, while in industry, all the factors of production, machines, raw materials, labor power can be produced and reproduced. In agriculture, the basic material, the land is limited in quantity. It is therefore a natural monopoly. We might put natural in quotes in that sense, because it's not perfectly natural in some ways. Anyway, held by a class of landowners, under capitalism, this class receives a rent from those who wish to lease the land. Land is leased for a definite amount and a definite period. Access is, see Hong Kong. Access is forbidden to the land until a rent is paid and the landlord exercises his right of ownership. Land is therefore also a property monopoly. Is that natural and property are identical in that context. The tribute for its use is called ground rent. A sybarite excrescence, a parasite on capitalist production, is the next section. It's clear that such revenue is unearned income, as the landlord does no work to obtain it. He receives rent simply because he's the monopoly owner of the land and grants his permission for someone else to use it. Marx concludes that the payment the landlord receives cannot come from anywhere else but out of the product of unpaid labor, namely surplus value. Of course, where else would these parasites get their share if not off the backs of the working class? Now, while they do not necessarily get their hands dirty in directly exploiting the workers, as the industrialists do, they contribute nothing to society and live at our expense. This unearned income is not direct but indirect through a third party. That is, the landowner leases his land to a capitalist who works the land by employing wage labor. We're talking about agriculture here for this particular moment. The wage workers employed produce surplus value through their unpaid labor, which in turn finds its way into the pockets of the capitalist investor. But the capitalist is forced to share his surplus value with the landowner in the form of ground rent. It's clear that rent can only come from the surplus value created by the working class. As Marx explains, quote, the capitalist who produces surplus value, i.e., who extracts unpaid labor directly from the laborers and fixes it in commodities, is indeed the first appropriator, but by no means the ultimate owner of this surplus value. Note that the commodity could be money. He has to share it with capitalists, with landowners, etc., who fulfill other functions in the complex of social production. Surplus value, therefore, splits up into various parts. Its fragments fall to various categories of persons and take various forms, independent the one of the other, such as profit, interest, merchant profit, rent, etc. That's from Volume 1 of Capital. And again, quote, this is from Surplus Value, Volume 2. The capitalist is the direct exploiter of the workers, but not only the direct appropriator, but the direct creator of surplus labor. But since, for the industrial capitalist, in this case, this can only take place through and in the process of production. He is himself a functionary of this production, its director. Now, the landlord, on the other hand, has a claim through landed property to absolute rent. And because of the physical differences of the various types of land, that is differential rent, and there are two types of differential rent, which enables him to pocket a part of the surplus labor or surplus value. That means that, if you invested in physical plant infrastructure or machines or something, that would be part of it. Fencing, even. To whose direction and creation he contributes nothing. Where there's a conflict, therefore, the capitalist regards him as a mere superfetation, a sybarite excrescence, a parasite on capitalist production, the louse that sits upon him. Don't hold back. Thus for Marx, unquote. Thus for Marx, surplus value produced by the working class is divided up between the different sections of the ruling class in the form of rent, interest, and profit. The capitalist holy trinity: rent, interest, and profit, where rent is paid to the landlord, interest to the moneylender, and profit to the industrial capitalist. Consequently, the struggle over the surplus is not simply one between the capitalist and the worker, as the capitalist also has to fight the landlord and the moneylender. That, it's all about financialization in that context, all of whom are trying to maximize their cut at the expense of everyone else. Now, in analyzing rent, Marx also made a distinction between what he called differential rent and absolute rent. The next section is absolute and differential rent. In industry, super profits are made by those companies that have a higher productivity than the average. They produce goods above the average socially necessary labor time. In agriculture, this can also be the case when the productivity of some land is more fertile and productive than others, and some more accessible than others, allowing it to produce super profits. It takes less time to get the stuff to market, etc. And thus to command a higher rent than the less favorable or productive land. The payment for these advantages is called differential rent. Ricardo wrongly considered to be the only form of rent, as do many others. Many people, because it's folded into ground rent, etc. However, Marx explains that the landlord also receives a basic minimum rent, which must be paid for all land, even the worst kind. This is called absolute rent. Now, you could hold absolute rent as zero for a variety of reasons, and in fact, one does that if you have, for example, you can argue that ground rent doesn't exist for public ownership in some cases. In this case, produce grown under these unfavorable conditions will still receive the average rate of profit. How come? Well, clearly land, if it's going to be used, must be able to produce a surplus from which the landlord can collect a rent. Therefore, even capital invested in the worst land must yield the average rate of profit. Otherwise, under capitalism, there would be no economic reason to cultivate it. The income the landlord will get will depend ultimately on the demand and supply for the land. Even on the worst land, he will receive an absolute rent, but nothing more. Such rents arise from monopoly in the ownership of land and will continue to exist as long as private ownership exists. The income the landlord will get will depend ultimately on the demand and supply for the land. Of course, ground rent is not produced by the land. A piece of wasteland does not produce anything, not an atom of rent. This rent can only arise from the production of the labor power engaged in agriculture, namely the workers on the land. It is paid from the surplus value that they create, but it is of a special type, not subject to the equalization of profit, as we will explain later. As explained, differential rent, it's DR1 or DR2, is the rent paid for the advantages that accrue from the higher productivity of land. Some pieces of land are better located than others, which can be more isolated or inaccessible. Other areas have different fertility, so that from richer soils, the same investment can produce better results. Now, some land produces better natural resources, as access to water, woodland, quarry, or coal mines, for example. Again, land located near a market saves costs such as transport, which lowers the general cost of production. Agricultural products from These areas are therefore sold at prices above the price of production. But this higher price ends up in the pocket of the landlord in form of differential rent, which arises from monopoly in the use of the land. The capitalist investor will, of course, continue to receive the average rate of profit, but the difference goes to the landlord. Wherever there exists a private monopoly of land, there will also exist opportunities for racketeering landlords to make a quick buck. However, if agricultural prices fall below a certain level, the land will become unprofitable, and at that point, rent vanishes from certain plots of land. They cease to be cultivated until prices once again rise. The whole issue of leaving some land fallow for a variety of reasons that are not necessarily about rent, but perhaps about cultivation, which ultimately does have a capital implication. In his analysis, Marx asks what lies behind the division of the surplus value, which is shared out between the different branches of industry and between the different kinds of capital. Now, before Marx can answer this question in the third volume of Capital, he first has to explain the formation of a general rate of profit. Now, this is closely related to the rate of surplus value. They resemble each other, namely the degree of exploitation. Of course, the capitalists and their apologists do not recognize surplus value. They get twitchy, which comprises all new value created by the workers as appropriated by the exploiters. And avoid this unpleasant term, as it only serves to reveal the underlying reality of capitalist exploitation. Instead, they talk about the more acceptable term of profit, which is, of course, very dear to them. After all, it's the reason for their existence and the driving force of their system. Remember, we talked about it yesterday. It's rent seeking. They have no interest in the ratio between the surplus they produce and the wages they have to pay out, i.e., the rate of surplus value, but are instead deeply concerned with the ratio between the surplus they get and the total capital they employ. This is the rate of profit. Next section, the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value. Now, there is some relation between these, and of course, in business school, they don't talk about surplus value. They just talk about rate of profit, but you can get to this at some moment. This rate of profit can be defined as the ratio of surplus values, surplus value S, to this lowercase s, surplus value, lowercase s, to total capital, which is made up of constant capital. And yes, here it's a C, the circled C, which is copyright, and that's only because the software, it's just lowercase c, and variable capital V. In short, the rate of profit equals S divided by bracket C plus V, the sum of constant capital and variable capital. Now, for our Mr. Moneybags, the capitalist, what he spends on wages, that is variable, wages are part of variable capital. And what he spends on raw materials and machines, that's constant capital. They're, it's more, palpable in that sense, more constant in that sense, are all simply costs of production. And the surplus he gets above these costs is his profit. As far as the capitalist is concerned, it is that simple. Now, for our Mr. Moneybags, the capitalist, what he spends on wages, that is variable capital, that's kind of part of it. And what he spends on raw material and machines is just simply costs of production. But different factors determine the rate of profit, not least the rate of surplus value. So rate of value, this is that moment where they diverge, the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value. For example, a capitalist invests 100,000 pounds, of which 90,000 is spent on raw materials and 10,000 on wages. If the rate of surplus value, that is exploitation, is 100%, the profit will be equal to the amount that is spent on wages, namely 10,000 pounds. However, if the rate of surplus value is increased to 150%, the profit goes up accordingly to 15,000. The rate of profit will be 10% when the rate of surplus value is 100%, and 15% when it is 150%. So this idea of super profit is already built into this general, difference. This is based on one single cycle of production. This is why volume 2 is important. You can see multiple cycles at work of capital, that is. If the turnover of capital, that's the reason why we read volume 2, the turnover of capital is increased so that two cycles are completed in the same time as before, then, assuming 100% rate of surplus value, the capitalist will get a profit 10,000 pounds twice, and therefore make a profit of 20,000 pounds on his capital of 100,000 pounds, which is a rate of profit, 20%. This increased turnover has doubled his rate of profit. Another factor can have an important effect on the rate of profit, which is the ratio between variable and constant capital. This is the machine issue. Sticking with a rate of surplus value of 100% with a single turnover, the capitalist instead invests only 70,000 pounds on raw materials and 30,000 pounds on wages. With a rate of surplus value of 100%, the surplus will equal the wages of 30,000 pounds. And the capitalist will make a 30,000 pound make 30,000 pounds on an investment of 100,000 pounds, which is a 30% rate of profit. This ratio between variable and constant capital is called the organic composition of capital. Now, through competition, the capitalist attempts to undercut his rivals and increase his share of the market. He therefore introduces new techniques and labor-saving machinery technology, which reduces his costs and allows him to produce at a lower labor time per product in relation to the socially average labor time, which determines the market price. So there's something that determines this average thing, but the way in which individual firms or capitalists treat it is different. He thus makes a super profit, but this only lasts until his competitors follow suit and also invest in the new techniques or technology, canceling out the old advantage. As more advanced technology is introduced, more is invested in constant capital, machines, etc., than in relation to variable capital or wages, resulting in a higher organic composition of capital. So you already see a kind of divergence. This produces a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Now, this is controversial, of course, but there are numbers that support this idea, although there are countervailing factors that also cut across this process. Now, while the profit rate tends to fall, the total amount of profit does not necessarily decline, as the total capital probably increases. Clearly, in different industries, the average organic composition differs widely for technical reasons, with some industries being more labor intensive than others. Wages can form a large part of the total cost, as for example in mining raw materials from the earth. Does this mean that the rate of profit in labor intensive industries is exceptionally high compared to the rest? No, in practice, that's not the case. But why is this? Now, the reason for this state of affairs is the powerful tendencies that bring about the equalization of the rate of profit. That is, there's this notion that at a large scale dynamic level, that something you can sort of see what the average is. And I truly, if Marx had learned more statistics, he would probably treat it differently. But while different industries can temporarily create a high rate of profit compared to the rest, this cannot be long lasting. That is, the capitalists who invest their money are seeking to maximize their returns. Should industry A earn less than industry B, then the capitalists in A would take out their money and invest it in B. Money would move. But what would that then happen? More goods would be produced in B and less in A, creating overproduction in one area and underproduction in another. There would be a glut here and scarcity over there, causing a fall in the price of products when there is a glut. And, this is just because stuff doesn't all happen in the same place or at the same time. And so you get this kind of, ebbs and flows of price and productivity. With capital moving from one to the other in pursuit of higher profits, this would change the rate of profit between the two industries, eventually leading to an equalization of the profit rate. That is, this price battle, and something would average out. over time. This tendency operates across capitalist production and in all industries. It's sectoral in that sense. This tendency for capital to be distributed between different branches of industry results in all capitals earning an equal rate of profit or an average rate of profit. At some moment you can measure this stuff. That's kind of what Marx is driving at. So you can actually say, well, this is how it describes this particular industry, knowing, of course, that there are highs and lows and all that other stuff in between. This is due to the competition between capitals and the effects of supply and demand on prices. This is over time. Marx therefore explains that in a developed capitalist economy, each capital does not appropriate the surplus value produced by its own workforce, but appropriates a part of the total social surplus value according to the proportion of the total capital it represents. So, commodities do not necessarily sell at their values, but at a price which equals their cost plus, this is the cost price figure, cost plus the average rate of profit. So you see this is the total, one way of describing total cost. That is cost at the firm level and cost at the sectoral level. Marx calls this price of production. Thus, the selling price for commodities can be represented as C plus V plus P rather than S, where P is the average rate of profit. Therefore, don't worry, there's not much more, there's no math elsewhere here. Don't get crazy. Therefore, as commodities tend to exchange at their price of production, each capital would receive a proportion of the total surplus value equal to the capital used. That is, the combination of all constant and all variable capital, regardless of their proportions. And so you would get this figure for the organic composition of capital. The sum total of prices of production is always equal to the sum total of values. No extra surplus value is created or destroyed. Now, the reality is that there's a lot more going on here, but and that's the reason why dynamic analysis is important ultimately. Because if you sort of restrict it to this, you can always, make up excuses for things. Quote, but this process takes place behind the capitalist's back. He does not see it. He does not understand it, see tariffs, and it does not, in fact, interest him, unquote, explained Marx in Volume 3. This conclusion that commodities tend to exchange at their price of production may seem to contradict the theory of value, where we're told that the value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time involved in its production. Now, this is the basis of the law of value, but there is no contradiction. Marx's theory has never said that commodities always exchange at their values. It explains that only through the fluctuations of price, not value, price, above and below the value of a commodity, do they tend to exchange at their value. So it is about the fluctuations, not the value itself, and not the price itself. Now, this is broadly true of simple commodity production, but this law needs to be modified to bring it into line with the realities of fully developed capitalist production. Such a development does not negate the law of value, but builds on it, revealing that in fully developed capitalism, because that's ultimately where we want to get to with the analysis. I mean, it's all fine in theory, but you really want to talk about capitalism writ large. Commodities tend to exchange at their prices of production. But this is a discussion that is not at a very micro level. It's about macro level stuff. The whole of Marx's Capital is an attempt to strip capital down to its fundamentals in order to lay bare the main laws that govern the system. So this is a micro-foundational argument, other people might call it. In theory, we assume that the laws of the capitalist mode of production develop in their pure form. In reality, this is only a approximation, explained Marx in Volume 3. The capitalist mode of production outlined in Capital does not exist in the real world, as it is an abstraction which allows us to see more clearly the real processes. This is the problem with people reading Capital, particularly non-Marxists, or, well, some Marxists as well. It's not predictive or determinative. It gives you just a structure by which we can analyze stuff, because it is a critique after all. All the secondary features are stripped away or ignored. They're not important. However, when we apply the general laws to the real world, and that's the crux of the Marxist argument, we need to modify these laws according to other tendencies at work. This is the only way to develop a scientific understanding, and this addresses the falsifiability argument. The emergence of monopoly capitalism, for instance, modifies and mangles the laws of capitalism with the siphoning off of monopoly profits, namely profits above the average rate of profit at the expense of society from the general pool of surplus value. Now, while the monopolies siphon off excess profits, this is only a matter of distribution. They do not add anything extra. The share of profit is limited by the total amount of surplus value produced in society, which in the final analysis is produced by the number of hours worked by productive workers, namely the total quantity of labor expended. Now, that's the labor theory of value as kind of winnowed down. As soon as you have the total mass of surplus value or the total mass of profit, the only way monopoly profits can be obtained is simply by the transfer of surplus value from other branches of production, i.e., redistribution in the process of circulation. This is that thing again about motion and movement and turnover. That's all part of this. A rise in monopoly profits means a corresponding drop in the rate of profit in other sectors of the economy. Now, the sum of prices of production must accordingly be equal to the sum of values. Now, that's at a macro level. Remember, this is you can't do this with simple equations and plugging in numbers. You got to think about this as a large aggregative problem. Quote, the sum of the profits of all the different spheres of production must accordingly be equal to the sum of surplus values, and the sum of prices of production for the total social product must be equal to the sum of its values. Now, this whole equalization business is a equilibrium description that, as I've said before, in a static model, you can analyze it. That's all fine and good, but it's really a dynamic operation with all of these other things going on. Now, housing crisis. Finally, we get back to this. In Capital, Marx is dealing with ground rent, which is part of the surplus value created in capitalist agriculture. This is not exactly the same as the rent commonly used when you pay for, housing. This is by and large payment for a part of the use value of a commodity, namely a house, but with a chronic shortage of housing, landlords can charge an exorbitant rent for their private dwellings. And you can see there's a scarcity thing that's built into this. Additionally, council housing rents over the years have covered the cost of the original house many times over and simply paid to cover the ongoing extortionate interest charges on the loans from the banks and building societies. There's a whole thing about building societies. Thrifts is a part of this, used to build the houses in the first place. Now, this is where the money lenders get their pound of flesh from a worker's rent. My own council house, this is Sewell talking, my own council house was built in 1929, probably for a few £100 in labor and materials. This amount over the years has been repaid in rent several times over in my old rent card, which was later abolished. It used to give a detailed breakdown of every pound paid in rent. I recall it stated that nearly 90% of my rent went to quote unquote interest charges, i.e., the money lenders. The constant rise in ground rent leads to a continual rise in the price of land. With the scarcity of housing in towns and cities, property speculators are buying up property as soon as it becomes vacant. These speculators are not only super rich individuals, but giant property corporations which can move around billions of pounds in disposable assets. These properties are often left empty as the chronic shortage and rising demand simply pushes up the value of houses and apartments. This results in ordinary people being priced out of such housing in our so-called property-owning democracy. Building land commands considerably higher prices than agricultural land due to the differential rent arising from its location. Sites in or near towns, which are suitable locations for housing estates, high-rise flats, office and commercial buildings, factories, etc., are limited and in great demand. No wonder supermarket chains and businesses have left the high street and relocated in out-of-town shopping centers or strip malls, while a growing number of town centers are run down. So what, might we ask, is the value of land? If the value of a commodity is defined by the amount of socially necessary labor time involved in its production, land must have zero value as it's not a product of human labor. It has no value any more than light, air, or the wind. Marx gives the example of virgin forest where there has been no labor expended on it. It is a gift of nature. Nevertheless, land, as we know, can attract a very high price. Therefore, things can have a price without having any value, technically. The prices of things that have no value in and of themselves, quote, either not being the product of labor like land, or which can at least cannot be reproduced by labor, such as antiques, works of art by certain masters, etc., may be determined by quite fortuitous combinations of circumstances. For a thing to be sold, it simply has to be capable of being monopolized and alienated, explained Marx. That's in Capital, Volume 3. In other words, where a monopoly of private land ownership has not been established, land has neither value nor price. It is the monopoly ownership that brings with it a price, i.e., a claim to an income. What we are dealing with here are monopoly prices. Quote, landed property presupposes that certain persons enjoy the monopoly of disposing of particular portions of the globe as exclusive spheres of their private will to the exclusion of others. Once this is given, it is a question of developing the economic value of this monopoly, i.e., valorizing it on the basis of capitalist production, unquote. That's volume 3 of Capital, which we'll be looking at, assuming that Andy Higginbottom's around to do his whole thing at the CSSGJ in the fall, and which I'm looking forward to very much. However, insofar as socially necessary labor time has been expended on a land's improvement, for example, adding drainage, putting on fertilizer, fencing, etc., then it does indeed contain a value in the true sense of the word. That is the only exception. Now, next section, price of land. So what determines the price of land? Well, it has zero value because it's not a product of labor. It certainly has a price. Well, it has a price because it got fenced off in that sense, which is determined by the income that it can bring annually. Quote, the price of land is nothing but the capitalized and thus anticipated rent, unquote, explains Marx in Volume 3. The price reflects the fact that land has a limited supply and certain prime spots can be very advantageous to a capitalist. Location, 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 allowing him to cut costs and undercut his competitors. Let us take as an example how the price of land is arrived at. The capitalist who buys a title to the land purchases the means to appropriate a definite amount of surplus value. Let us suppose this amount is £500 a year. Now, land has zero value because it's not a product of labor. It certainly has a price, which is determined by the income that it can bring annually. Of course, where the capitalist invests his money depends on the return that it'll get back. This, incidentally, is how a general rate of interest is formed as investors scramble around trying to outbid one another for the most profitable outlets for their cash, causing prices to be brought down to a general level. Let us say, for the sake of argument, this prevailing rate of interest is 5%. Then an investor can get an extra £500 a year for lending a sum of £10,000. Now, for sure, he can invest his cash in hand and take a slice of rent instead. But he clearly won't invest £10,000 if he's only going to get back £250 when he can get a return of £500 by lending it directly or leaving it in a bank. Similarly, no one will lend money to get £250 if they can get £500 by leasing a piece of land. Therefore, if the rate of interest is 5%, the price of land with a rent of £500 per annum will be £10,000. That means an investor with £10,000 could either lend his money and get £500 a year, or buy a piece of land and also get £500 a year. Now, in this case, the price is simply the capitalized rental. It follows that if the interest rate falls, now remember, the interest rate is a aggregate, right? It's established by money lenders or the government or whatever, the owners of the currency. The price of land goes up. In our example, if the interest rate falls to 2.5% from 5%, the price of the land will double to £20,000, as there would be no difference between investing in land or leaving the money in the bank. Both pay an income of 2.5%. Therefore, if the price is fixed at the amount which would bring an equivalent income if lent out or deposited in a bank at a set rate of interest. This is why you should never, whatever. Thus, land has a price, which is often extortionate but it has no value as the price represents no expenditure of labor time. This is why Marxists regard the price of land as fictitious capital. It simply allows the capitalist investor to siphon off a proportion of the surplus value from the rest of society. The entrenched monopoly nature of land ownership introduces all kinds of peculiarities. For instance, the monopoly prevents the free movement of capital from industry to agriculture. While individual capitalists can lease land, they are nevertheless faced with a landowning class whose economic interests are tied to renting, which guarantees them, of course, that steady income. They are a rentier class, rentier, the rentiers, rentier capitalism. It's their purpose in life. They'll not relinquish monopoly ownership of land for this reason. This then becomes a barrier to capital. That is, to free movement of capital. While capital could freely enter and leave every sphere of industry, it cannot freely enter agriculture. Well, yes, it can, but, well, that's for another story. Technically, agriculture is on a lower level than industry, where the organic composition of capital is just lower. Where the same amount of capital is invested, more surplus value is produced in agriculture than industry. If capital were, this is why people buy, property, right? If capital were able to move freely between agriculture and industry, the rate of profit would be equalized through competition. It's not. But this is blocked by monopoly ownership of land, which is a function of a whole bunch of other things, including, time, title, warrant, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, agricultural products are sold at prices above the price of production. As explained, the excess obtained goes into the pockets of the landlord in the form of rent. A function of monopolies under capitalism is to prevent the equalization of the rate of profit by restricting the flow of capital between different sectors of the economy. This is, in essence, the role of monopolized landed property. Marx himself explains this qualitative difference between industry and agriculture. Well, now, why, in contrast to other commodities whose value is above their cost price, remember I talked about cost price, competition between capitals does not reduce the value of agricultural products to their cost price, he asks. The question already contains the answer, because, according to the presupposition, this can only happen insofar as the competition between capitals is able to effect such an equalization. And this, in turn, can only occur to the extent that all the conditions of production are either directly created by capital or are equally elemental or elementally at its disposal as if it had created them. Now, with land, this is just not the case because landed property exists and capitalist production starts its career on the presupposition of landed property, which is not its own creation, but which was already there before it. The mere existence of landed property thus answers the question. All that capital can do is subject agriculture to the conditions of capitalist production. Since landed property exists, capital must, however, leave the excess of value over cost price to the land owner. Clearly, Marx had no feelings for the moneybags industrialists, but he had even less for parasitic landlords. Quote, this rent is characterized by the palpable and complete passivity displayed by the owners, whose activity consists simply in exploiting advances in social development, particularly in the case of mines or mining, towards which he does not contribute and in which he risks nothing, unlike the industrial capitalist. Finally, by the prevalence of a monopoly price in many cases, and particularly the most shameless exploitation of poverty. For poverty is a more fruitful source for house rent than the mines of Potosi ever were for Spain. The tremendous power this gives landed property when it is combined together with industrial capital in the same hands enables capital practically to exclude workers engaged in a struggle over wages from the very earth itself as their habitat. This is kind of the structure of small towns. One section of village here demands a tribute from the other for the very right to live on the earth, just as landed property in general involves the right of the proprietors to exploit the earth's surface, the bowels of the earth, the air, and thereby the maintenance and development of life. Unquote. That's from Volume 3 of Capital. Surplus value is not created in circulation or through financial transactions, but in production. Profit is nothing more than the unpaid labor of the working class, which is expropriated by the capitalist. But the capitalist is forced to relinquish a share to the other bloodsuckers, the landlords, the financiers, and the moneylenders. The landlords simply exploit their monopoly position to extract a portion of the surplus value produced by the working class. They do not create the cake, but they're nevertheless take a slice of it. No doubt, they're very busy shifting around pieces of paper and making phone calls, but they add nothing to the wealth of society. Next section, nationalize. We're getting close to the end. Nationalize the land. Over time, the distinction between the landlord, moneylender, and capitalist has become blurred. Their activities have become merged. Compared to the past, the capitalist no longer personally supervises production, but delegates this role to quote unquote professional managers. They've become simply coupon clippers limited to buying stocks and shares without any direct involvement in running a business. See crypto. They are constantly looking for shortcuts to make money, which is their overriding ambition. In their rush to make money, they're keen to take advantage of every opportunity that arises. As soon as convenient, they abandon their role in production and become mere rentiers. They increasingly turn away from investing in industry and real production and prefer to make profits instead through speculation in a casino capitalism. Trillions are now invested in quote unquote derivatives, which are fictitious capital, not based on the production of real wealth. No, they're just numbers or math in that sense. The banks have become international monopolies, too big to fail. Finance capital has become dominant, and it is a clear example of parasitism of modern day capitalism. Giant monopolies straddle the globe and use their economic muscle to extract monopoly profits, reduce their taxes, and collude with pliant governments. They have a multitude of investments across the board, but especially in land, property, and finance. In this twilight of the capitalist system, investment in productive industry has all but dried up as the ruling class engages in novel ways to make their money, mainly through speculation in property wheeling and dealing. In the capitals of the world, properties are acquired not for use, but purely for speculative gain. Likewise, they plunder and loot the state through privatizations, one of the greatest robberies in history. These bloodsuckers have become a colossal fetter on the development of the productive forces. These facts are further confirmation of the parasitic and senile nature of 21st century capitalism. See White House. Marx's theory of rent still retains its relevance, particularly in this epoch of crisis. We're faced not with underproduction on a capitalist basis, but overproduction of agricultural products and commodities generally. Capitalist farmers are paid to deliberately keep land fallow so as to keep prices high. See government cheese. There is no need for world hunger if food production could be organized rationally. The solution to the land question is its nationalization, together with the banks and the building firms. A socialist agriculture would be part of a national plan of production, where the giant monopolies would be taken out of the hands of the billionaire class and run democratically in the interests of the majority. Production for need, production for use, would therefore supersede production for profit. Rent in all its forms would disappear, as would landlords and capitalists. The last word, however, would go to the communist Gerald Winstanley. Quote, in the beginning of time, God made the earth. Not one word was spoken at the beginning that one branch of mankind should rule over another, but selfish imaginations did set up one man to teach and rule over another. Landowners either got their land by murder or theft, and thereby man was brought into bondage and became a greater slave than the beasts of the field were to him. The earth is to be planted and the fruits reaped and carried into barns and storehouses by the assistance of every family. And if any man or family want corn or other provision, they may go to the storehouses and fetch without money. If they want a horse to ride, go into the fields in summer, or to the common stables in winter, and receive one from the keepers. And when your journey is performed, bring him where you had him without money. The common snowblower. If any plant food or victuals, they may either go to the butcher shop and receive what they want without money, or else go to the flocks of sheep or herds of cattle and take and kill what meat is needful for their family without buying or selling. That which is yet waiting on your part to be done is this: to see the oppressor's power to be cast out with this person, and to see that the free possession of the land and liberties be put into the hands of the oppressed commoners of England. Unquote. Well, okay, we got to the end, and yes, there's a message at the end. What we've been listening to is Parasitical Landlordism and the Marxist Theory of Rent by Rob Sewell. Um, has a certain poetic nature to it, needless to say, but it does describe all of the issues, and we can see it explains Marx, particularly volume one by using volume three and surplus value and the theories of surplus value. And I think you can see how integrated that is. You see who the enemy is, or that it's not necessarily personified. Often it is simply something more abstracted or opaque. And that's one of the other issues. And I hope that you'll get from this a certain sense of the structural problems engaged. Tomorrow we'll read something slightly different, and I hope that you'll engage that. There's no questions, so I will. Thank you for your participation or your attention, and return you to your regularly scheduled program. Note, of course, that the visit to Ground Zero of Nagasaki, done live or in live stream by Joe, occurs, I think, tonight after Spirituality and Activism, as opposed to being tomorrow night. So uh, be here or be square or whatever. This is the autonomouscollective.net. Please come visit, join us. Stopping share